Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today I'll be looking at the current Top 5 compositions for patch 11.17. The latest patch brought the downfall of quite a few 3-cost compositions and the return of 4-cost carries. Along with 4 and 5-cost boards, there's also multiple 1-cost reroll builds running rampant through the meta. That said, the current meta is in a great place because no build is truly dominating. All the builds in the top 5 are competitive with one another and have similar power levels. The main difference is consistency going into the late game. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off, our number 5 composition is not so much one specific comp, but instead a compilation of all the current 1-cost reroll builds that are floating around in the meta. Yes, this is kinda cheating a bit since we're combining multiple comps into one spot on the list, but most of these builds are comparable in viability. All of them start from the same place. What starting components that player has, which champions they hit, and how much gold they have going into Krugs. Those are the 3 main factors that determine whether or not rerolling is worth it. We're going to briefly cover the 3 most common reroll builds, those being Vayne Forgotten, Kalista Aatrox, and Ziggs Spellweaver. Vayne has returned to the meta after a long hiatus, thanks mainly because 2 ranges were buffed and true damage is highly valuable in a meta that favors heavy defensive frontliners. The idea behind the Vayne reroll comp is similar to how it functioned in the past. Pick up a lot of Vaynes, make sure you have a Rage Blade, and reroll for Vayne 3 after Krugs. Alongside Vayne, the most common board is going to mainly comprise itself of Forgotten Champions, particularly Thresh and Hecarim. Another Ranger is necessary, and in some cases you may run 4 Ranger if you have the emblem for it. But altogether the comp is about Vayne dealing true damage and ramping up throughout the fight with Rage Blade. Next, Kalista Aatrox. Of the 2, Aatrox is more important to 3-star because Aatrox can be turned into an unkillable machine. Well, at least until the late game. Kalista is just a byproduct of rerolling for Aatrox since those 2 champions pair well together. It's also common to see Leona 3 in this comp for the same reason as Kalista 3. The idea behind this reroll build is to pack a bunch of defensive stats on Aatrox and make him unkillable with Redeemed, Legionnaire, and any other defensive synergy that you can fit in. Kalista prefers items like Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, and Last Whisper that you can also give her KAYLE items to pivot into the late game. With Aatrox 3, it's actually possible to rush level 9 because most boards will have trouble dealing with him until the late game. And lastly, of the 3 most common reroll builds, we have Ziggs Spellweaver. The idea behind this build is utilizing the recently reworked Spellweaver, which removed the cap on ability power scaling. Ziggs with a blue buff is the perfect carry for this because he'll spam cast a lot during the fight, adding additional ability power to himself and other Spellweavers. Brand is also great for spamming, but Ziggs is preferred as the carry. As for the comp itself, it can get by with early Hellions to buff Ziggs, then transition towards either Abomination or a standard Revenant frontline. The entire game plan revolves around hitting Ziggs 3 with blue buff, and then 4 Spellweaver. Everything else is really just up in the air. Okay, that's the 3 most common reroll comps. There's a few others, most notably the Dawnbringer reroll composition with Gragas, but it's far less consistent than the 3 we talked about. Overall, if you're a fan of rerolling, this is the perfect meta for you. With that, we can move into our next comp by going in the complete opposite direction with a 5-cost build. Coming in at number 4, we have KAYLE. Finally, after several buffs and many reworks, KAYLE is a playable carry in set 5. A lot contributed to this happening between multiple buffs in patch 11.17, the rework to Legionnaire which made the healing functional on KAYLE, as well as multiple buffs in previous patches to help propel KAYLE into the spotlight. But there is a glaring issue with KAYLE, and that's her being a 5-cost champion. It's difficult to transition into a KAYLE composition because finding her is never a guarantee, so you may end up stuck with a subpar board. KAYLE works best when you're focusing on a different carry and board, and then transition into KAYLE when you find her. Forcing a 5-cost like KAYLE is very much so a 1st or 8th style of play. This is made even harder by the fact that KAYLE needs 2 specific items, Rage Blade and Death Blade. Since she's an auto-attacking carry that scales, Rage Blade is a must-have for her. Death Blade makes her scaling even more insane because it adds additional true damage since her ability is based on her AD. Thus, with these 2 items, she can scale incredibly well in a fight. Okay, so it's difficult to play KAYLE consistently and you need the correct items for her. Why is KAYLE even talked about in the meta? Because when a player hits KAYLE 2, they're almost guaranteed a top 2. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not too far off of reality, as KAYLE 2 with the right items and good board backing her up is ridiculously strong. Almost no other late game board can handle KAYLE outside of one-shot mechanics like a blast from Heimerdinger's turret or Viego sticking on KAYLE. All in all, we recommend not hard forcing KAYLE, but instead trying out mid-game builds that help you get into the late game so you can transition into her. Champions like Varus, Vayne, Aphelios, Draven, and Nidalee can all be item holders with similar enough boards that you can use to pivot into KAYLE. Let's move on to the next composition, coming in at number 3, Jax. Jax remains steadfast as the best all-around melee carry of the current meta. Riven, while playable, took too much of a hit at level 3 to be consistent, and Yasuo was basically culled out of the meta entirely. Nocturne with Assassins are a close second to Jax, but even then, they will struggle. That leaves us with Jax, a carry with an amazing power spike in Stage 4. Stage 5 is where he begins to lose a bit of value, and then from there, the later the game goes, the weaker Jax becomes, as his scaling is not up to par with a lot of other late game carries. But thanks to his Stage 4 and 5, Jax is a viable carry to use if your goal is to place in the top 4. As for the composition around Jax, surprisingly, it's not 6 skirmishers. While yes, you can play that variation, it's nowhere near as strong as 3 skirmishers with a bunch of defensive traits. Most commonly, we see Jax played with 3 skirmishers, 4 knights, Ironclad, and Mystic. The reason for this is that Jax needs time to ramp up in a fight. The longer the fight goes, the higher his attack speed and attack damage will be, so defensive synergies to stall out the fight are the perfect way to complement his playstyle. Galio and Rell are by far the 2 best for helping him stall out the fight, with Galio being a second item holder a lot of the time to help boost his survivability. Speaking of items, make sure you have some type of healing items for Jax, either a Bloodthirster or Hand of Justice. Last Whisper is usually a must-have as well to help Jax against defensive front lines, especially since Ironclad is the most common counter to him. The third item can really be anything, but more utility is always helpful since he naturally gains additional damage the longer the fight goes on. Jax may not be the best late-game composition, but it's certainly one of the best mid-game with the potential to win lobbies if you can hit a Jax 3. With that, we can move on to our number 2 composition, Abomination. Try as they might, Abomination is still a fright. Nerf after nerf has come to the synergy as well as the common carry champions that pair with it, and yet it's still one of the best options in the current meta. A lot of that comes down to the Abomination champions, mostly Nunu and Fiddlesticks. Nunu is a beast throughout the early game and into the mid game, while Fiddlesticks opens the door to a lot of possibilities, namely Revenant. Revenant is the most popular frontline synergy, so having a trait like Abomination easily paired with it is fantastic. With these 2 synergies, it's possible to buy a ton of time for your backline to dish out damage. Of course, the backline for Abomination is in a bit of disarray after both Vel'Koz and Heimerdinger received nerfs, but they are still both capable of carrying. The main issue for Abomination is hitting those late game champions, so having a strong early and mid game is essential. Thus, we don't recommend forcing Abomination past Stage 3, only run it if you naturally find the champions for it that you can roll for at level 6 and 7. From there, you want either Zyra, Vel'Koz, or Heimerdinger as the main carry. Luckily, all 3 of them use similar items, those being Shojin, Archangel Staff, and Jeweled Gauntlet. And lastly, make sure you're tossing in as many defensive items onto your Abomination champions as you can to help boost the survivability of the monstrosity. If you combine all of those factors together, you're left with a solid mid to late game board that can easily top 4 and even win the lobby. Now for the composition coming in at number 1, Rangers. Let's first preface this by reiterating our original statement. There's no major power difference in any of the top 5 comps, with the exception of the 1-cost reroll builds, as those tend to scale poorly. The reason we have Rangers sitting at number 1 is that Aphelios is by far the best all-around carry in terms of late game consistency. Jax falls off late game, Heimer and Vel'Koz have conditional requirements, and KAYLE can be difficult to find in 2-star. Aphelios with proper items scales extremely well into the late game, and being a 4-cost is much more likely to 2-star him compared to the 5-cost carries. In addition to that, you can play 2 variations of the build around him, one for the mid game and one for the late game. In the mid game, look to play a 4 Nightbringer 2 Ranger board, adding in champions like Lulu and Rell if possible. From there, you can look to pivot into the late game by adding Akshan over Ashe, hitting Aphelios and Diana 2, Teemo, and the trio of Revenants for frontline. This board will win against most late game comps, though it may struggle against KAYLE if Teemo isn't hitting her with his ability. There are downsides, however, such as Aphelios needing Rageblade to do well. Plus, the late game board is quite expensive, with most of the champions being 4 and 5 costs. But as we said, Aphelios can get by in the mid game with a much less expensive board, and then you can transition into the more expensive one later. As long as you can 2-star Aphelios with proper items, you should be in a great spot to consistently top 4 with Rangers and likely place higher with the late game board. Alright, that's it for our top 5 compositions for patch 11.17. But before we go, we have a few honorable mentions to talk about. Our first honorable mention is Nocturne Assassin. Nocturne is still a fantastic carry, but may struggle to come online consistent enough to be played often. Since you need Nocturne 3, Diana 2, and all of the Revenants upgraded, it can be difficult to consistently put this board together. Instead, think of Nocturne as the type of build you play when you high roll into it instead of forcing it. With that mindset, you can definitely win a lobby here or there with Nocturne Assassin. Next, we have to talk about Riven. Riven 3 got hit quite hard by the nerf bat, making her much less viable as a carry in the current meta. Of course, when it comes to the early and mid game, Riven is still an amazing item holder. If you high roll multiple Rivens by stage 4 and 5, and 3-star her, she's definitely still viable. The issue is you have to high roll Riven 3, otherwise you're better off transitioning into a different AD comp. Luckily, Riven uses the same AD items as most other carries, so you can always play her in the mid game and not have to commit to her if you're not finding multiple Rivens in stage 4. And lastly, we have Draven, a carry that is just on the fringe of the meta. At times, Draven looks great. Other times, he pales in comparison to all the other AD carries. The main issue with Draven is that he can't target the backline and his damage isn't high enough even with items to get through the enemy front line. That said, he's a great item holder for KAYLE or even Aphelios, so he's at least playable in the mid game. Just be wary of sticking to Draven too long, as short of hitting a Draven 3, you will find it difficult to place consistently in the top 4. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. All in all, the meta continues to be in a great spot. The main issue is a lot of the compositions rely on late game champions to scale well, and that can be difficult to pull off consistently. Let us know in the comment section below which compositions you've been climbing the most with. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.